am so excited to be here, our final in the series, and wow, it just seems like we started in January, just yesterday, talking about how we're in the post-America world, and gave the economy a polite C at best, saying we're having a real struggle, amongst other things, being able to pay for a lot of our current needs. Last time, and we had Sasha on that panel, one of the overall leadership competencies that folks were saying we needed was collaboration. So whether it was dealing with national security issues, technology issues, collaboration being that very specific leadership skill that we need. And today we're going to be focusing in a little bit more specifically on considering the context in which we're leading and not the best budget, where do we pinpoint our resources? And just like in the previous sessions, we have Reggie who's going to be helping you in the chat. So please make sure you put all your questions and comments in the chat for Reggie to ask our panelists. Reggie, do you have any comments before we start?
Yes, I do, Michelle. I couldn't take this on without first thanking you. It is so exciting for the Key Executive Leadership Program to be in this partnership with TEI and under your leadership. And you're right, it really has gone very quickly. It's almost amazing. We're into the third session, and like the other two, we have an outstanding panel for people today. So I happen to be an executive in residence at American U and Key Executive Leadership Program, School of Public Affairs. My prior work was with the Social Security Administration. I was their Chief Human Capital Officer for a 15-year stint. And I know all too well what it's like not to have enough resources and wonder about your relevance into the future. So with that, I give it back to you, Michelle.
Awesome. And so, Sasha, I'm going to start with you since you're our bridge between the second panel and this one. So we were talking last time about skill sets, and collaboration came up as the major skill, but we still need to know substantively, what should we be focused on as a government, considering the fiscal constraints that were raised in the previous sessions, and how do we know that those are the right, if you will, activities to focus in on?
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. It's so fun to be back with everybody. So, I've been thinking more about it since we last spoke as well, and kind of what collaboration means more explicitly. And I think there's two things to sort of pull the thread on and think about operationalizing that. One is from an organizational design standpoint, right? How are our organizations designed and organized to collaborate, right? Whether that's externally facing to the government. Again, we talk a lot about this in cyber in terms of public-private partnerships, and whether the government's even organized to engage when those opportunities arise, right? So looking at that organizational design piece, to me, is critical. And I think the private sector too, I talk a lot about this with folks in the tech sector too, need to think about how they're organized to interact with government, right? And that is not something that everyone's necessarily grown up with. So taking that step back and actually thinking about whether we have the organizational structure that enables that kind of collaboration is one thing. And then the other piece that I know is probably more commonly thought of, but extremely difficult to do, right, is the hiring piece. And to bring people into the organization who have those skills. We too, I have the pleasure of being also an executive in residence at the School of Public Affairs at AU. And we work a lot with our students, both at the undergrad and graduate level, to start before they begin their careers in the public sector, to think about that skill building. And I just am thinking about this because I have an assignment in my class to go out and interview a practitioner and sort of build a new relationship, and sort of walking through the blocking and tackling of that. Obviously, as you grow in your career, these things get more sophisticated, but do we have the time and the training programs and the focus on bringing the people in who have those skills? So let me start there. I know there's lots of ground to cover today.
Great. So same question for you, Ted. How do we know where we should be focusing our efforts, given the fact we have limited resources lot of issues we need to solve now, and we have to be able to anticipate right now what's going on in the future.
Right. I would answer that question, also too, from my experience in government, which I always tell people I'm still getting therapy for now that I've left, is, we have to be able to prioritize. And part of that prioritization or the road to that prioritization really looks at a number of things. One is we have to look at what's the road ahead of us? What is coming next that we have to see? And so we have to, really learn from the future. And, a way that we can do that is really using futures intelligence, strategic foresight. So really taking a broad look at what are the kinds of information out there that we need to be aware of, whether it's looking at mega trends or change drivers, or what's kind of the wild or anticipating wild cards, those or black, we call them black swans in some cases, those events that are improbable but are likely to happen. But really, I think it all comes together by using our strategic thinking and foresight to get a sense of what's possible, what's more probable, and then what are the capabilities that we need to have across the board, and really investing in our capacity to ensure that we have capabilities that allow us to be as agile and flexible as possible. And that's going to involve bringing people in and collaborating a lot more with, to Sasha's point, with outside organizations and sources that we might traditionally not work with, and who are definitely outside of our narrow kind of industry or sector focus.
Thank you. Amy, what should we be doing now with our limited resources to meet today's needs and the future? How do we know?
So the joy of going third out of fourth is the opportunity to pull on sort of strands and threads that have already been set up by other people. So moving backwards, I fully agree with Ted about the need for foresight. And when I thought about this question, I thought a lot about the question, which was how. So to sort of continue with a roadmap of how, the only reason that there's a need to actually prepare for 2030 is because we expect that it will be different from now. Otherwise, we'd know what was relevant. We're fairly aware of what's relevant today. Let's give ourselves credit for that. So people have to develop a view on that. And that goes back to Ted's point. But there are a couple of other things to figure out along the way. One is the rate at which you believe certain things are changing. If automation is coming to government, what's the speed at which it's changing, and what is it? Third, what's going away? So part of a strategic plan now can't only be, it can because the government does it, but it might not only be additive, it might also include phasing out what might no longer be necessary. And I actually think that's useful in any large bureaucracy. And then fourth, again, to pull in that abstract sense on Ted's point, is to understand how different changes are intersecting, where different government agencies have the opportunity to influence things. So the government's a big animal. It can influence a lot in the world, but that's part of prioritization, is understanding what you would like to influence. And then with those in view, you could develop a viable vision. So my place to start would be, well, actually the answer isn't quite there yet for specific agencies. And then I had 3 areas where I thought there were probably changes coming up. One is, I thought the overall question for the session was very interesting because it acknowledged that the government is in a competitive situation, which is weird. Did a government in 1950 ask how it should be relevant? I'm not so sure. It was naturally relevant. So who is the government's competition? And I might take a step beyond. I love the answer to learn that this conversation has been about collaboration all the way. I go a little bit further than that. I think there might be new compacts and things that go beyond the public-private partnership. There was one of the, I don't want to sort of start engaging politics, but one of the political candidates in the last election had the notion of chartering very large companies as public benefit corporations, which is challenging in the US context for various reasons, but moving beyond, moving into that space. The second is to move from a customer service sort of concept, which maybe the government's been in for some time, to more participatory governance. I know that there are many experiments on that front, some better than others, but there are some great ones out there. And then the third, just my own, is around, it's not just health, it's bringing the body and the ways in which the paradigm of the human body is changing on many fronts. So the Army and the military are all over this in certain respects, and the brain was brought into view a couple of administrations ago, but there are such significant things happening in the realm of genetics and genomics that will engage, they just go in every direction. So I think that where it's relevant, the human body should be a part of the conversation in ways that extend beyond health.
Awesome, thank you. Bethany, same question.
Ooh, this becomes more and more difficult. What I'd rather do is just engage in conversation. But I'm with the federal government and I have pre-approved talking points and they get very upset with me when I go off script. So I'm gonna stay as close as I can. Definitely all the things, right, that everyone has said, and where you stand does depend on where you sit. And I sit with the Centers of Excellence. We do IT modernization. Now, I'm also not a technologist. So my answer really relates to how do we, where can we invest good quality time, yes, a little bit of money in skill sets and capabilities that are going to position us well, no matter what directions we end up having to go in, right? And so on the IT and data side, we're always going to need the data and in your information in an organized way that we can pull and we can access and we can blend and we can share. And so the data infrastructure and the IT infrastructure that helps us organize and access all that and helps us provide the services to the citizens in the way that they want services delivered, that it's easily accessible, that's cost effective. So for me, and I don't know specifically what they are, but there are things in the data and IT infrastructure space that we absolutely must invest in pretty heavily. But again, I'm not on the tech side. I'm in innovation adoption and change management. I'm on the people side of this. So I am also going to say that it has to be that data and IT investment at the same time that we're also doing investment in our workforce skills, the types of skills that help people and teams and organizations pivot and read the landscape and make adjustments. And the World Economic Forum does do their projections, right, of what the top 10 skills are of every 5 years. They keep them pretty well updated. I think they're beginning to cheat just a little bit because the categories are becoming compound instead of single skills. They're becoming compound skills, but they work, right? It's we've got to have the problem solving capabilities for whatever problems are coming down the line. We're not going to know what they are 5 years from now, but we need to be ready for them. And we got to have those problem solving capabilities within our workforce, and not just the people themselves, but the organizations need to have that ability to do that collaboration and bring the cross-functional expertise together to do the problem solving collectively. And it's, then how do they work together? Right? Whether it's through decision-making or implementation, you know, we've got to learn to work well together. And then there's the self-management piece. And so the World Economic Forum, they really do have the 4 categories. A few things are in that tech space, but most of the things are in that human space, the very universal skills and capabilities that we all need to prepare for and pivot and shift and adapt and make sense of things as we go. I think what's nice about kind of the intersection of the data and IT and the human and team and organizational learning pieces is that a lot of it has become pretty cost effective to acquire and make those investments in. There are so many online learning platforms with some good courses delivered by top-notch professors right, all across the country. And yes, we have software vendors out there who want to teach you how to use their particular software, but they give you skills when they do that. They give you skills that are still pretty transferable when you learn how to use that piece of software. So there really are some wonderful cost-effective ways to take advantage of what's available, to invest in those things that are data and IT and human and team and organizational behavior. And as long as we do that in groups, or better yet, in teams where you can apply the learning immediately, it becomes not just long-term, learning for us in terms of our strategic positioning, but immediately applicable and immediately useful. So it's probably not a focus, right? There's still many things, but if we invest in the things that position us to be ready, then I think we'll be in good shape. We can be in much better shape.
And so a question for all the panelists. Bethany, if you want to go first, since we'll go. So when we're working within our context right now, we tend to be, even when we say we're future oriented, relatively short-term relevance, because we're meeting what congressional milestones are or other stakeholders that have very immediate needs, because as we've discussed in the 2 previous sessions, there's a lot going on right now. So how would you recommend we become more future forward thinkers when our organizations do, for very good reasons, have so much going on that's right now? And that's where the drive is to the employees.
I think that is a tougher question, right? It really is about, there's no such, in some ways, there's no such thing as future proofing when we are in that operational zone. It's tough to take the time to lift up out of our operational crises and demands, certainly. I think that, again, back to that question of investment and how we learn and how we invest in our capabilities, it's the immediate application of what we're doing with the eye towards the long term. In the strategic planning world, for instance, I come from a organizational performance standpoint. Strategic planning, oh my gosh, I love the future thinking. Let's imagine grand, big things. The truth is, long term is like 3 years out now. It's really tough to, the future thinking is beautiful and it opens up our opportunities, but then we have to be able to back into, but what can we address now? What can we learn now? What can we apply now to help position us for that longer term, strategic evolution kind of over time. We're never going to be able to not meet the immediate needs. And it's not just of Congress. It's not just of our superiors, but we have to acknowledge there is greater demand from our citizens and our communities and all those we serve to deliver better now. So being able to invest in some agile work methods, right? It's where we can figure out how to deliver value right now while we're still building towards a bigger kind of grand vision, and how we contribute to it in bits and pieces over time is what's important. Again, I'll always still bring it back to those fundamental data. We're always going to have to make data. We need to be making data-driven decisions. So we've got to base that in data. We've got to be, we've got to collaborate, and we've got to share information, and we've got to have the platforms and the IT systems to do that safely, right, and in a protected way. But we've got to have those our wonderful humans, right, to make sense of it all, by working together in that cross-functional way.
Amy, anyone else want to comment on that question?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think that there are two things. One is a version of mindset change. So the urgent and the important, like in that favorite, I guess it was authored by Eisenhower, I'm not sure, right? But they're always considered to be in opposition. There are things that are right now, and there are things that are later, and we split those up into 2 time periods. But it doesn't take that much. I mean, it's a kind of a trick of the eye, right? If you pull back, you realize that they're part of the same thing. That doesn't mean that everything that Bethany's talking about isn't true and that people don't feel the need to solve issues right now. But good leadership will recognize that some of the urgent challenges from right now actually originated back there. And so having that kind of framework, right, a long time ago, as a just as a, as a viewpoint, as a how are we going to preempt the urgent? How can we preempt the urgent in the future is sort of number one. And then the second, in the more concrete, again, hearing you, and I'm sort of very grateful that I'm not in the position to actually ever be responsible for this, but there are, you can, and I have seen companies, and I work with government agencies who do get futures training from my shop and like that. And there are ways to sort of stage work so that, you figure out all of the things that need to be dealt with today. And then you start, staging elements so that you're doing some of tomorrow's work now. And in the meantime, you're also hopefully decommissioning that which no longer needs to be done. So there are frameworks for kind of thinking about this. And it, I have complete belief in the because there are a number of examples of the capacity of organizations to really do this.
Ted, any comment?
Sure. I think I would add that, if we want to move away from the immediate, the urgent and the immediate all the time, you have to incentivize it. And it has to be part of an organization's culture and structure to be futures oriented. And so, we can look at ways in which we might appoint people within the organization who really are responsible for being futures oriented, as part of their job, so that you always have someone that, you don't leave it to them just by themselves, but you have somebody who it really is, their role to bring those thoughts up, to ask those kind of questions. And then that's got to be sustained, through the planning process. Possibly one of the things to do is in the strategic planning process. And, Bethany and I go back years, as performance folks and planning folks. And, actually building that into the planning process, that, let's have part of our planning process actually be 20 to 30, 40, 50 years out. Because we have to create, a lot of us who are, in fact, I would say all of us probably who are on this webinar have a heart for public service. And part of public service is thinking about future generations and what are the decisions that we're making today and what are the implications that's going to have down the road. And, I like to use the phrase, study a firehouse, because we always talk about, I'm so busy putting out fires. Well, if you're always busy putting out fires, you're never prepared for the next one. And you're going to be caught off guard at some point. And fire departments actually plan all the time. They practice all the time when they're not actually in the role of putting out fires. And the other suggestion that I'd have is start engaging with external stakeholders and experts and others out there, like Amy and others who do this for a living and think about this. And, you can bring in to think about and help structure ways to or questions, give you questions asked, structure processes to help the organization move forward. But it really does have to be incentivized. It has to be intentional.
And Sasha?
Thanks. Well, I mean, I 100% agree, and it's wonderful to listen to everybody's perspectives. I guess I would offer too, to kind of maybe sum up also, there's two categories, right? There's thinking about the future, right? And I think Amy talked about that, like what exercises, and I agree with Ted too. When I was at the FBI, not just allowing, but encouraging and incentivizing, right? People to do academic partnerships, people to attend conferences, people to meet with external stakeholders and interest groups, right? It doesn't just happen because you're running through your day. So there's those set of things that is about how do we think about it and bring in those new ideas. And then, as was discussed, there's a whole set of things about how to operationalize that, right? And not just have that be, okay, you met with stakeholders, or you did that offsite, or you took that class, but how does that come in to the planning processes, as Ted said, to the performance evaluations, to those things, to the budgets, right? To the things that we know actually drive the organization going forward. So I guess I get the benefit of summing up, but I think there's things to do in both cases. And there's lessons learned in both cases, and one doesn't work without the other. So keeping an eye on both of those buckets, I guess, would be my kind of summary.
And about a year and a half ago, Amy, I think I was at a conference with you, and all of a sudden, right next to me appeared an avatar. And I was so shocked. I never had that experience before. I was telling the other panelists, like, I spilled my tea all over the place. It was just out of this world that there was an avatar who just showed an avatar could move. And as we're talking about the future, and I think Bethany really alluded to this, I'm not really sure who my future coworkers are. Are they bots? Are we going to be working with each other? It's going to be avatars coming in and out. And that leads to the question about what is uniquely human that we as individuals who really are passionate about the public service are going to be doing. And then how do we navigate this technology world that, while folks are saying it's really going to be about the bots. So I'll start off with you, Amy, since you were the one that kindly invited me to that conference that scared the living daylights out of me at the time. I was like, what century am I in?
I think that's so great. Now I have to, okay, I'll catch up with you afterward. But I mean, aren't we already working with bots? And we're working with apps all day. We negotiate with them, whether we're driving. I haven't hired a copywriter in ages or an editor, because I have an app that, right, and it's much, it's less talkative and more expensive, less expensive. So like that. So I think that we're sort of crawling into that space already. And part of, yes, our coworkers are already, in my view, bots. And to take what Bethany was saying a step further, okay, so let's step back. So one, sort of, I loved your comments about working with data, and to kind of paw on them. It seems to me that nobody on this panel, that we out there often have the wrong idea about what being flooded with data means for us, because we need more us. We need to be there more. We have more ethical issues, more issues that require our judgment. We need more understanding. And this was going to be sort of my answer to, I think this question was, actually, I would put data literacy. I think we're going to get emotional skills training. We will get resilience training. We will get critical thinking, hopefully, in there, these sorts of things. But actually, data literacy is low in this country. And I think we're all going through, unless we were already in public health, a flood every day of trying to understand, for example, what does a vaccine's effectiveness mean at a public health level when things are in the aggregate, and what does it mean for me? And there are so many of those sorts of questions that are around aggregate risk levels and small ones, just to take a daily, a day in the life of a person with a watch that does things for them. So at a personal level for citizens, we need data literacy. And then inside the government, I think there's a need for information literacy. It used to be what happens when your email, if you use email, Congress people, what happens if, when it leaves your desk, where'd all those little packets go? But now it's, it's actually moved on. And then the other is maybe for people in government to recognize that the modalities that we use are changing, and to get ready, Bethany will help us get ready, I guess, for audio and for avatars and for other things. And then there's a whole other segment, I'll leave this for other people to talk about, but about team building with computers in our midst, so that it's really not about being replaced. It's about having systems, and those systems can help us think in a future forward way, because they're systematic in ways they can help us keep records of what we thought we were anticipating last year, for example. So that's my slew of half bullet pointed answers.
So Ted, as we go forward, who are our teammates? Are they bots, and what is uniquely still human?
Well, we're always going to deal with people. I mean, ultimately, and I like, how Amy, I think, framed this, is that the modalities of how we might interact are going to change, and are constantly changing. But behind that is the psychology of how, and the sociology of how people interact, how they live, how they view things. And so there's always going to be a need, no matter what the technology is or the structure, that we need to include, we need to collaborate, we need to persuade people in our work. And so whether we're using artificial intelligence or machine learning, if you look at the changes, I think fundamentally there's the piece behind it that makes us human, is that we use these things to connect. I mean, if you think about how we're all on our phones and looking through them and all that, what we're really looking at is, and wanting to do with them, is connect to others, to connect to information, to connect to other people. And the reason that we do that is because we're trying to reach having, and this is what civil servants can bring: empathy, compassion, intuition, understanding. And I think back to one of Amy's earlier points about moving away from customer service, this kind of customer service mentality, which is really transactional. And that's not to say to get rid of customer service, but we are well into the customer experience economy. And it's about the experiences that we have. And that's what humans can bring. Humans can make the technology more experiential in a way that can be humanizing. But ultimately, I still think at the end of the day, we all want to connect. We're all here, looking at the webinar. The reason that we're all here is because, we all may be sitting at home, but we want connection with others.
Thank you. Sasha, any comments on the future?
There. Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I guess to add on to these, again, really thoughtful replies, I would maybe just add kind of a policy perspective from like a tech and cyber policy perspective. And that is both at the macro level as a government, we're still sorting out, right, what role we want technology to play in our lives, in this country, globally. And the word norms comes up a lot, and it's, we can say we don't have good tech and cyber policy because some political reasons or whatever, but also we haven't settled on norms, right, of how much of this we want where. And so I think it's important and empowering to think about that too, that there's choice here, right, about the way we're going to go forward. And cyber is not something that only happens at CISA or only happens at FBI or only happens at OSTP, right? Cyber policy is something that every sector-specific agency, Treasury, Energy, HHS has a role in determining, what these norms are. The executive branch has an incredibly large role in kind of that influence as these things get debated in the public square, get sorted out from a policy perspective. So I think that's an exciting space, and I think it's important to remember we all have a role in that. And then also at a micro level, right, in terms of either ourselves as individuals, in our teams, in our agencies, right, we have influence and impact and agency, small a agency, to make decisions and stay in the driver's seat, right? And we've seen this with COVID. It's been so interesting how people have said, again, we're on this webinar, right? Things have sort of sped up. Things that may have taken 10 years to happen have happened over the course of the last year. But now there's this conversation about, well, what do we want to keep, right? If and when we go back to normal, there's choice, right? And do we want to let go of some of those things and go back to the movies? I do, and stop streaming, but maybe we can have webinars, right? And again, that's sort of a simple example, but even when we're talking about AI and machine learning and bots and 1,000 things, avatars, there's choice too, from a policy perspective at both the micro and macro level. And I think, especially in the executive branch, again, in every department and agency, there's a ton of influence to be had in this space. It's very much still up in the air, right? And unsettled. So for what that's worth, one off.
Thank you, Bethany. Are we in the future of bots?
So yeah, I think we're early in the future of bots, and I apologize. In addition to us having coworkers that are bots, we have coworkers that are house pets when we're working from home. Really like to engage in the work process. I have a very hard worker here. Yeah, we are in it already, but I'd say we're still in the very, very early stages. There's certainly lots of very advanced companies doing lots of great work in the artificial intelligence space, and maybe more than we're aware of, maybe even more than we're comfortable with. But in our federal space, we're still in the very, very early stages that we have a lot to learn about. Amy, you mentioned it, the governance of how these things are built and how we work with them. There are ethical discussions to be had, just like humans can. We need implicit bias training for all kinds of things in order to make good decisions. We have to inform the technology as that is beginning to become robust, because it's easy to build in the bias right in the beginning, and those routines will just train and train and train and continue the bias. So we've got to have folks who are, again, they're creative thinkers and innovators and futurists and truly creative problem solvers, and people who can imagine and predict in a way that data can't predict what might go wrong if certain things travel down another path. And yeah, to Ted's point, it's absolutely, we do have to learn to work with all of that, and while at the same time making sure to not just, I won't even say maintain our humanness, but amp up our humanness, right? In this customer experience space, we've traditionally been a government of processes and procedures, and we need to have those. We absolutely still need to have those, but that's where a lot of the technology can come in on our behalf and take care of those things more easily, more efficiently, more accurately than we humans can. And let us humans do what we do really well, which is get in touch with the humanness and understanding and design and creativity and problem solving. So yeah, bring it on, more of it properly, and having both workforces work well together for the greater good.
And Reggie, I think we have some stuff in the chat.
We certainly do. The first question that came from Migdalia was, how do you propose selling the importance of training to be ready for the future? Be ready to pivot, adapt, shift, etc.
Ooh, I'll give a quick answer to that. The way to sell it is to say you need it right now for an immediate problem that the person who has to approve it wants to have solved. That's the trick. That's what we do in change management. We might have grand visions for what we believe the future of the organization needs, but the way to sell it, right? The way to influence that decision maker or the folks who are doing decision making, you got to bring the data on the problem that they care about right now. And it's our creative work on the back end to really connect that again to how that builds to the future.
Great answer. Anyone else?
I would say,
Oh,
Amy, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Ted.
I was just going to say, all we have to do is look at what we're living, or just read the news. We have, in the last year, we have seen the most not probable occur. We are in this situation with COVID. You look at Texas and what happened there. I would venture that a lot of what happened in the Texas situation was lack of foresight, and lack of actually being able to acknowledge that, yes, they could have temperatures below freezing for an extended period of time that would have an effect on infrastructure. And not being ready for that creates problems. So I think, as we look at the need for this, I think that's the same question that we had 30 years ago with, why do we need to look at performance? And GIPRA comes out, and, agencies spent at least 7 years, delaying that, most agencies. And then our friends at OMB put together the PART, if anybody remembers that. And that goes to, I think, Bethany's point, that put some immediacy into the needs that we had as federal leaders to get on the performance bandwagon. So again, it goes back to, I would say, to the earlier point, we have to structure this in, we have to build it in. You can sell it immediately, but it has to be incentivized as something that is a required competency or skill, as much as any of us have on the wide variety of things. We all have to know project management, we have to know performance, we have to know the personal side of interactions. So this is one that, in fact, I would recommend that if we were looking at the ECQs from OPM, this would be a suggestion to put that in, or maybe make it much more explicit as a competency to have.
Thanks, Ted and Amy.
Yeah. I think that day is coming, Ted, or maybe that's what you were saying, that more than just have to, that basically writ large, foresight will be like strategic planning, like something where people say, yeah, we'll just get one of those. I was going to sort of reflect back. I was curious, when Magdalia asked that, who she needs to sell it to. But just to reflect back, I have kind of sussed out that I work with a lot of people who are in some sort of deputy position, who are someone who with enough senior management or enough middle management space to sort of see and have vision, and they're often working for somebody else who doesn't, and they're frustrated. And they say, how do we? So they're the people. They're like literally the person who like wants to sell up. And I don't think that there's really an easy answer for that, except maybe pulling the thing, all the examples that Ted gave of sort of, we'll look out there. But to sort of, for another tactic, I think talking about the future can be counterproductive for those sorts of people, and that what's useful is to talk about the need to recognize what's changing now. So it's just maybe a twist on what Bethany was noting, but like, don't mention the future. If you're really in selling mode, talk about the need to be in an anticipatory space and to understand what's evolving, what we need to see. And, then you can pull out all of the more exponential change and, a few other like good words, and try that. That's a bad answer.
You,
but
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is from Bradley. He says, following on Magdalia's question, In addition to selling the importance of training and development for preparedness purposes, how do we acknowledge the issue of needing to build better resilience strategies into our training/development activities, as well as our programs? And how do we link training and development to that resilience need?
I'll add just one thought and sort of take in that second part of the question around resiliency. Again, in the world where I work in cybersecurity and cyber policy, obviously resiliency is something, and getting folks to invest in, whether it's training in resiliency, which there's a huge piece of, physical investment in technical tools that enable resiliency, right? How do we get folks to think about resiliency and preparedness in that way? And one of the things that a former boss of mine at the Bureau, who's out in the private sector now, we talk about this a lot in class, and I had him in as a guest speaker. And he talks to a lot of CEOs about resiliency and investment in resiliency. Again, whether it's in the cyber kind of hardware space or around training for the executive branch. And something he said has stuck with me, and that is folks tend to think that it won't be them, right? They're sort of like, yes, the world's complicated, but not for me, right? Like I have a simple little office over here in name the agency, right? And to Ted's point, it's sort of like people just, again, we could have a whole separate conversation around our assessment of risk, right? And what we overemphasize and what we de-emphasize. And what he was saying in the cyber context that helps is explaining that it doesn't always have to be targeted, right? It can be random, right? In the cyber world, someone could be targeted, and then that malware, for example, can get out in the wild. And even if you run you make maple syrup in Vermont, right? You may end up being a target. And it doesn't have to just be because you are particularly vulnerable. Same goes with the weather, right? We sort of have areas that we think of specifically and we think about resiliency, but now we're learning, right, that those areas are spreading. And so it's just one idea. It's an idea that's really stuck with me, is that sort of talking about this idea of randomness, right, in terms of things happening or how much things are changing, and that it may not have been us in the past who needed these things, but things are changing so rapidly, we see in these other contexts, it's important to think it may be us in the future. I thought it was such a helpful feedback about how to get folks to think about resiliency a little differently.
Thank you. This next one is from Migdalia again, and she says, would you say the challenge to establishing those norms has a lot to do with people and their personal opinions who are afraid of change, especially when they have direct control on what we purchase, how we prepare, et cetera?
I'm happy to kick this one off without a very satisfying answer, but just to kick it off by saying, we know that people are resistant to change. We expect that people will be resistant to change. And frankly, I would be concerned if they weren't. It's actually something we know about the human brain and the human condition from evolutionary perspective. You should be afraid of things that you don't know anything about until you can learn about them and you have that experience, and then you understand either from yourself or from someone else's experience that it is safe. But because we know that about humans, that's what our job is to get in front of that and help a person or a team or decision makers, whoever we're thinking about. That's our job, is to anticipate what that resistance is going to look like based on, what their role is, how they think, what they're responsible for, what they care about, what keeps them up at night. That's our job, to help anticipate that and engage them in the change process, right? In change management, I hear it way too often where it's like, oh, we just have to communicate, over communicate. Yes, but that's just pushing information out at people. That's not engaging folks, right? They still have to take that information in and process it, and they get to decide what they're going to do with that information. But when you engage them in it, it becomes, you start to break down what's scary about it, because they're in there with it, tinkering, right? And playing around with it, and they're understanding what the risks are, and they're making their own judgment calls about what risks are worth it and what risks aren't. So that's really a big part of what our job is. There's going to be change all the time, and we know that people will be resistant to it, and they should be. It's our job to figure out how to engage them in that so that we get better decisions, we get more engagement, and we get more, I hate to say buy-in, but we get greater participation, because out of that, we actually get better solutions than when a team of experts is off in a corner by themselves designing the perfect answer. It doesn't exist. We know from decision theory that when you engage more people from a cross section of thinking styles and across, a variety of diverse fields, we know we get better answers and better solutions.
Thank you, Bethany.
If you wanna, I was going to say from a different direction that one way to look at norms of behavior is that they actually emerge as opposed to being established. And so people will decide for themselves. I mean, this norms have sort of come up in different contexts in this conversation. So it might be an actual decision about how to engage with technology in a government agency, which might be a little more top down. But if it's the broader sort of how are we all in the world, going to be and govern and want to be with our technologies, then those are just going to emerge out of behavior. And the potential role of a government and other sort of those in leadership roles is more to sort of assess and understand those flows and then to kind of direct them. And I think Sasha was talking about organizational design. Was it you who kicked us off with that? Is to start to sort of design things so that people go a little more this way and a little less this way. But there's more of a negotiation perhaps than here are the rules for some versions of norm evolution than others.
Thank you, Amy. Here's a question from Frank. He says, how may the role of managerial leadership play in the future of executive leadership in the context of more decentralized and digitalized in a more digitalized world, tech-driven world?
So I'll jump in again just to give an example. I don't know that I have, again, I might not have a fully satisfying answer or perspective, but Google went through this many years ago when they were looking at flattening their organization significantly and it was a bit of a hypothesis that maybe we don't need middle management. Like really, I mean, we have super smart people. They're very engaged. We trust them. This is not an issue. Why do we need a layer of management managing them? They're fantastic employees. You actually do need managers. They found out they're an incredibly intensely data-driven organization that they pulse survey their folks all the time. And it turns out when a manager exhibits a certain set of traits, they started off with 8 traits and then they continued their data collection and as they implemented giving those managers the experience of learning to exhibit those 8 behaviors, they actually expanded it to 10. And they're human, again, they're all about human traits. They're about, number 1 trait is being a good coach, right? Like be in my corner and help me figure out my own problems. Don't tell me what to do. Being invested in an employee's future and invested in an employee's career. So I think if we actually took a step back in the federal government, and it might be the case in all kinds of large organizations, I'm not sure, but we teach our new supervisors how to use the time and attendance system. We teach them the things they are and are not allowed to do in a hiring process. And all very important things. But what we haven't done as good a job in that we need to do is actually just helping them learn and not teaching them. It's not really about teaching. They probably have the inherent characteristics in there already. We just need a way to help them recognize that what those traits are of what being a good manager is, so that you can maximize the productivity engagement of the workforce that you have. You don't need to direct the work. Your job is to help your wonderfully talented, gifted, committed public servants give the best that they can, because they have a lot to give.
Yeah, I would respond to that question from Frank in terms of if Frank, if you mean managerial leadership in terms of overseeing function, and executive in terms of really setting kind of direction for the organization. I think the context of a more decentralized and digitized world means that there's going to be a lot more connection at all levels. And I'm sorry, my cuckoo clock is going off in the back. And because of that, you're going to see, I think, a blending of the need to have strategic thinking at more levels in the organization. It's not just the purview of the C-suite, and I forget with Treasury, if it's the 5th floor, the 7th floor, it's state, it was the 7th, Mahogany Row. And so, we have to look at ensuring that as part of our leadership, that we're really externally aware of what's going on. And that, again, we have to be intentional about looking at what changes are occurring out there, as well as internally in the organization. And so what we're looking at is seeing where are the connections. I think you're going to start seeing even more data being used about reaching out to influencers, especially in social media, as well as who talks to one another, social network analysis within organizations and outside of organizations to really see how do we drive change? Where are we getting people? How can we engage them? And again, that's going to be done through technology.
Thank you, Ted. Naomi asks, in the introduction, Amy spoke about the shift from providing customer service to the need to include customers in governance. Is the governance you are referencing about CX and including the customer in the design process, or is it more than that?
You have access to questions that we can't read. So I was looking for it. Just to make sure I heard the question right, if I sort of respond first, it is what did I mean by customer service? And was it just engaging customers or citizens in this case?
Yeah.
Or stakeholders, let's say, because they may be employees as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I am drawing on, and I think I'm sitting with 3 people who have more experience than I do working in the government proper. So, but I mean, the history of government, the sort of customer service in the government like this goes back to the late 80s, 1990s, with an explicit sort of idea that governments should be more like markets. So everybody's like living in that now. And the evolution that is occurring in little pockets is maybe in the direction that actual market-based consumer-facing organizations have gone, which is toward a version of co-creation. So, I don't just sell you the jeans, I share with you, all the ways you can help make them. And what does that look like in a governance space? How can you help make the rules that we all want to live by? I feel like it would take a long time to go into there are a few great examples of these sort of books on my, but let me stop, and I'm happy to type them into the chat and share concrete examples. I think I'm probably sitting with people who have some themselves.
Frank has a question. How can cyberspace be resilient if considering the reality of cyberspace that cyber attacks, threats, risk can come from anywhere, anytime, by anybody, who are almost not trackable?
I'm ready to go on this one. I was hoping to get to this one. So I think this is such a great question and such an important question. If I can start, I think it begins with defining what resiliency means, right? And that's the first question. So an example I use in class all the time is cyber resiliency in terms of my academic work, right? generally means, because I'm not working on any patents, for example, that I just need access to it, right? If it gets stolen or replicated, I actually don't care, right? No one's probably going to teach my lectures for me or use my writings in any other way. So the only thing I need to be 100% resilient in terms of my academic work is a backup, right? And I'm resilient. That's resiliency for me in those needs. So that's one example, right? If you then get to a situation where it's okay if the data gets stolen, but it's not okay if the data gets changed, right? That's another kind of resiliency where you can say, I want to make sure, again, with a backup or otherwise, that it's fine if people take things, but they just also can't ever have access to change what I have, right? In terms of my records, because I know that. So the first thing comes down to breaking down resiliency into what's actually needed. And we talk about this with companies all the time, right? Resiliency can also mean the capacity to identify something's going wrong quickly, right? And so have internal alarm systems. So you're right, things are going to happen, and making sure systems are built such that you know they're happening, right? So even if you don't have everything you need, you can respond and build back and mitigate more quickly. Another example. And then does resiliency for a business mean, again, it's okay if my website suffers a DDoS attack because I have the capacity to start up again somewhere else, right? So again, you're absolutely right. We are never going to get ahead of the threat in the cyberspace. We're never going to prevent all acts, as happens in law enforcement across the board. But when you start breaking out for individual needs what resiliency looks like, I just need access to my stuff. I need to make sure my stuff isn't changed. I need to be able to stand up a new payment system if this payment system goes down for a business. You know, when you go along that continuum, there are ways to build resiliency in. There are then parts that are very, very hard, obviously with very, very sensitive data. And that's where we reserve the fanciest tools, right? And are most nervous and have the most restriction of people to that data. But there's a large continuum up to that can be worked around. And there's a huge education piece and behavior piece change too. And again, not to go on too much about this issue that I'm fascinated by, but most of the issues here come down to something with humans, right? And we know that that's a huge element of sort of the cyber risk. And so building resiliency through long-term educational programs, don't get me started about two-factor authentication and passwords, right? Like these are all things that can be addressed and mitigate and protect and build resiliency up to, along that continuum.
Thank you, Sasha.
I think, I would add that, part of it, when we think about resiliency, in a broader kind of idea like cybersecurity or things like that in the public sector, often I think what we're really getting at is, are we prepared? Are we prepared for the unexpected and the unknown? And that becomes something in, again, our decision-making and operations processes of, do we place value on being preventative as opposed to being reactive? And so, when we look at events that cause great damage or change or destruction, most of those are foreseeable. They were things that you could imagine happening, but decisions were made not to prepare for them. And we have to do the risk management and I think it does come down to, and this is the human side of this, our values. Whether or not we're willing to pay more for trying to clean up the damage versus investing in preventing it. And so, as part of, I think, this series that you're doing, looking at how do we do better speculation or prospection of what are those high impact events that might lead to things. And again, I think a lot of that is seeable if you look and are looking around at what's happening. A story a couple of weeks ago of a hack into a very, very small water reserve in Florida. That hack could have poisoned and did start to poison, or not poison, but change the balance of the reservoir's water. Thankfully, it was stopped. But that just, knowing that could happen at that level, or seeing what else is going on in what we might consider isolated incidents, beginning to see the pattern and looking for that pattern of what could occur, what do we need to be ready for. But part of that, to be able to do that, is we have to be able to get past what our own assumptions are, what our own paradigms are of how we think the world works. To be able to allow in information that is contradictory or that we don't want to deal with. And then kind of continuously monitoring when we see these events happening, what does it mean? In asking those questions, do we need to be prepared for this?
Thank you, Ted. Here's a question for Vicki, and it's something that I think we can all relate to. How do you let someone down gently if their ideas cannot be acted on or leadership doesn't go for them?
I'll go real quickly. I'll tell them, welcome to my world. It's happened to me 800,000 times. And here's what I do. I save it all because guess what? 6 months from now, they're going to ask a question. You bring this back up like a little bit different, with a little different angle. You to Bethany's point, you make it relevant to the issue of the day in 6 months, and boom, you're off to the races. So number one, I say this happens all the time. It's happened to me every single time. So this is the iterative process. And also I say, if I had $1 for every time I propose something, they say no. And 5 months later, they say, I need this other thing. I'm like, oh yeah, let me work on that. Right. And wait a day. And then I dust off my thing, change up the colors a little, frame it, as Bethany said, to the issue of the day. And all of a sudden, boom, you're fully funded and off to the races. So that's my quick answer. I know it's extremely frustrating, but in my experience, 15 years in government, it works 90% of the time. It comes back around. If it's a good idea.
Your point is so well taken. The burning platform always gets the attention. And you tried to tell them it was going to be burning, but they didn't believe you. So now it is. So now they'll believe you. Yeah. Been there, done that.
I was gonna, if you'd like, just sort of interject that, this conversation started with collaboration. And so this question that emerged for me and looking at this question, where are your allies? Ideas sort of free float in organizations, and maybe what you really have is a piece of an idea that should be acted on. And so part of that collaborative learning might be all of us learning how to think about our ideas in a different way, and think about the ways in which they free float, and think about others differently as well. So looking for allies might be another or an additional approach.
Yeah, and not to beat this one up. Yes. And a third view on it is, and I'm making assumptions based on what the question might not be what the question was actually asking, but in so many cases, it's a more a staff level person bringing an idea to a more senior level person. And in my mind, that's just reverse delegation. We don't why would you no, if you believe that's a great idea, I, as the manager, I'm going to say, great. Where's the evidence, right? Where is the coalition? Where's the evidence? What's the idea? What's your first step? All right. It's don't drop it up into my lap, right? Unless we're all kind of getting in on the same issue, and we all believe collectively that it's something we need to address. I love to encourage folks to continue to pursue those ideas. It's an entrepreneurial way to look at things inside of government. You got to create the demand for that thing inside of government space. And if you can't make the demand for it, it's just not a thing. And right, you'll have to wait till the crisis or wait till it comes up again, whenever it is. But I don't usually say no. I say, how? What's your next step? And I'll even say, how might I help? But I'm not going to take it for you and run it up the flagpole on your behalf.
Thanks, Bethany. Frank has a couple of comments. One is leadership must, he emphasizes must, know where to go and how to get there. And I assume he means in a constructive way. I've had people tell me, as a leader, where to go and how to get there, but that's a whole nother thing. And then he says, cyberspace is the 5 domain of national security defined in the National Security Strategy since 2002. However, the reality is that the domain is suffering 9/11 type of attacks each and every day. I don't know if anyone wants to comment. If not, I can go on to Michael's comment.
I'd like to comment briefly on the
Go ahead.
first part. I cannot, if we're sort of taking seriously what we're saying about, you know, some elements of the future, then Frank, you can sort of hate me from afar, but actually leadership doesn't necessarily know where to go because we don't know entirely where the world is going to go or where the future will lead us. So they should know some of the things that like Ted and others have been talking about. How might we understand where we could have to go? How do we build resilience and so forth? But actually, I would take a little bit of issue with that and say that there's asking leaders to do that at this point when we live in this sort of black swan world, and one with hidden opportunities too, is to put them in is to put the concept of leadership in an untenable place that's like actually not good for the people who are leaders or anybody else. I think, I don't know, it's a world that's worthy of humility at this point, and maybe a different concept.
And I would just piggyback onto what Amy said. You know, knowing where to go is not just the job of the leader, or understanding what the future may bring is not just for the leaders alone. And so on leadership's behalf, again, as we've talked about, you know, in the message and for this session as well as the last one, collaboration, getting multiple perspectives in, inclusion of people into the process, so that you've got listening posts all throughout what's going on in the world to understand what may happen and what you need to be prepared for, either to take advantage of or to protect yourself from.
Thanks, Ted. Michael asked the question about, are there any strategies on how managers can build coalitions now? And he uses this gathering as one example, in order to best employ strategic foresight and preparedness. So when we are the executive leaders, we can remain relevant and more resilient.
Maybe a place to start, just sort of one of the building blocks. I think this is a wonderful and big question. But again, in the context that I think about it most often is thinking with our students and to sort of think about how to start out in their career, right? To be someone who is building that coalition as they go. And I always tell them, you don't need this to get the job. I mean, you do need sometimes it to get the job, but you'll need it when you get in the job. And they don't believe that. I mean, that's what this question is about, right? And we on this call and this webinar know that to get things done in government, you need that coalition, right? For ideas and for implementation of ideas. To start off, and I'm sure everyone has thoughts on this, the easiest thing for me is I think about sort of responsiveness and trust, right? And when you have that opportunity to interact with people, sort of delivering something of interest, and I always recommend if people ask anything of you to be responsive, right? And I don't mean responsive like maybe sometime I'm responsive, but like quickly responsive, right? And I've been amazed in government how much trust that builds, right? Because we all know on this call, if there's someone you know that if you need something, either they'll get back to you right away with an answer, or they'll get back to you right away and say, I don't know, but here's 3 resources, or let me help you, right? That speed of responsiveness, that follow through, to me over time in my career, it's just, I feel like it creates this environment where people will try me, right? And I'll be able to then try them. And that sort of builds this relationship and this coalition over time where there are people I can try. When I reach out to people, I never hear back from them, or they get back to me 3 weeks later with I'm not sure. It's sort of like, is that like going to build this coalition and tighten that bond of trust and sort of move forward together? So just from a fundamental level with my students, I always talk about that first foundational piece around responsiveness and trust starts to build those blocks, and then you build out from there. I'm sure others have awesome suggestions as well.
I'll speak from since this question specifically asks about strategic foresight, some of the couple of things that I see working in in the federal government elsewhere. One is having a group of people develop skills in strategic foresight, not all of whom are tasked with a strategic role. So people in financial management, people in, and doing it together. So one is that skills building actually means that, then they are in a coalition. When I'm not sure I would call it coalition, but they are in a capacity, in a position to continue sort of teaching forward, and to building inside of their organization. And they also have pieces of foresight in different spaces. So that's one. And then to Sasha's point, I was also thinking about that early point. There was a point a few years ago, and I think it's taken off, where the Army built a course in strategic foresight for majors, as opposed to for, right, by the time somebody has a few stars on their shoulder, everybody thinks they know where they're going to go and what's going to happen, right? And that's what they want to know. So skills building at an early age in some of the sort of formal spaces where education is offered or training is offered is also like a sort of a concrete building step. But I would say skills as opposed to, knowing the thing itself. Your content, and your agency knows its content.
I would just answer kind of also in this, that it's really important to not remain within your swim lane. It's to build coalitions across different kinds of organizations and contexts. I know, when I was growing up in the federal government, I would thankfully be able to go to a lot of different, when we had executive breakfasts and things that were put on by, companies. And I think somebody had made a reference to this earlier. And it was Bethany, like IT companies will build skills. So I would go to things that were being put on by like Adobe. And I would learn not only what's happening in technology, but I would meet people who had different perspectives that I could call upon later to give me advice, or if I needed something to, call them to say, hey, I'm thinking about this. How would you respond to it? And what I tended to find was that people who were outside of, my traditional lane were the ones who gave me great ideas on what was happening, and a sense of understanding what was going on in the world that was going to that might be adjacent or different to, my sector, but it did get to my sector at some point.
Okay, well, we don't have any additional questions. Frank did leave a comment. Collaborative leadership is definitely critical, but it should come up as a strategy in which defines an organization's goals and objectives, and where you're going and how you're going to get there.
So we started off the panel series with some comments from outsiders saying, particularly due to the pandemic, all of what's changed in international borders, that we might not be relevant anymore. And others in the private sector are seemingly able to actually respond with more agility and to the crises of the day. And I think through this the panel series, we've actually seen that we can remain very vital. There might be some new skill sets we have to think about, some new mindset changes, the collaboration, looking at different partners, not just our interagency friends, but throughout. I would turn it over to you, Sasha, Ted, Amy, Bethany. Any other tip you would have of what we might want to do skill set wise, mindset wise, so that the government really is relevant in 2030, and all of us who are passionate about helping the American citizens, we're doing the job that they need us to be doing?
So I'll make probably an unconventional answer, but with that context, Michelle, I appreciate that. I think, and there are exceptions certainly to the rule, but the federal government has done a pretty amazing job, frankly, with a responding to a crisis that we did not necessarily maybe prepare well enough for, let's say. I mean, we did not anticipate, I mean, people, let's step back. People certainly anticipated that there would be pandemics. That the people who do this for a living certainly anticipated that pandemics were in our future. Now, did we then go ahead and fully prepare for that future well enough? Probably not. But to some of the comments that both Sasha and Ted have made, the ability to be responsive when they come up is as important as maybe the prevention. And in some cases, we did a terrible job. But in many cases, there are lots of federal agencies who did a pretty amazing job under pretty terrible conditions and circumstances. We have a massive vaccine in record time, bypassing like our history of how fast can we make this happen? Oh my gosh, it'll take years. No, it doesn't actually have to take years. And we can work with private sector and research to develop solutions to problems in a more rapid way than we believed we could previously. And I only give that example to say I become hopeful for what our future might be, because now let's fast forward to next year. Someone comes and says, I have an idea, and normally the answer would be, nope, we can't do that right now. I would point back to COVID and say, well, we did that. We now have proven a lot of what we are capable of doing under these crisis conditions that we should be able to replicate, right? Under maybe less critical conditions, hopefully. So I'm actually quite hopeful. This doesn't answer the question, Michelle, to the actual skills, but the thing that we've learned in this experience is not necessarily the skill, but it's that we can do more than we believe we can do. And we can do it within most of the rules, and do it safely and do it effectively and do it in a collaborative way. So we are capable of much more than we gave ourselves credit for. And now that's the new bar.
Wow, thank you, Bethany. Amy.
So I would say something scary, I think, before returning to Bethany's point that there's, right, the government does well. I think there's often, I encounter sort of private sector envy. We should partner with them. They could do this, they have all that. But one of the things that people in government don't look at is the fact that, and it's not because they have bills to pay, but that institutions actually can transform radically, and they can also fail. And they don't fail in the way, it would be, I think, awesome if people in government, that one of the skills was getting used to thinking about the paradigm of kind of government itself. Because a lot of things around government start to be accepted as kind of sacrosanct truths, because it's just so weird to think that things are ever different. But we don't live in a feudal world. I mean, we don't government, like, things change. We don't live in we've seen massive institutional cultural changes from little seeds. So earlier in this conversation, there was a mention when we were talking about, I think it was around things being urgent or important and like that, that Congress is always, they have to do things in a particular way. Budgeting cycles are 4 years. There are all these things that seem to be set in stone, but there are these, permissions, and we can't, but they can be moved. The paradigm can be changed. And so going sort of a step up, another strategic level up, no one person can do it. There's no one in charge of it, but government could actually evolve. And I personally believe that it actually will in the next 100 years, and it could be in a productive, an amazing direction. But it has to be people beginning to think really weird thoughts about how different government can be from kind of era to era.
Thank you. Ted.
No, I would echo what Amy and Bethany have said. What I would add to it is I've dealt with a couple of agencies who experience irrelevancy. Was part of one who was thought to be irrelevant, and that has since long been disproven after we were dismantled. But But one of the things that I found in it is that in those experiences is that where irrelevancy comes from is lack of external awareness. And then I think, to Amy's point, dealing with it. You know, if we allow the paradigm that government can't change, or we can't talk to these people, we will become irrelevant. One agency that I worked with, because they had stopped doing some things because of resources and they hadn't adjusted to living within that resource change, nonprofits came in and started doing the work. But they didn't do it as well. And they didn't do it in a way that was as authoritative as it needed to be in that particular domain. Another agency, one of my favorite stories is a regulatory agency that I dealt with in 2015 and 16. The last time that their authorizing legislation had been updated was 1976. And if you think about the changes in our society between 76 and 2015, it fully had an impact on how they were able to do their work. And when we asked, why haven't you gone up to the Hill and asked them about this? Well, we can't talk to the Hill. It was like, well, okay, let's start with at least who you can talk to. And thankfully, within that year, they had created committees and had changed that. But, you know, it's those kinds of things. It's if we have blinders on and we saddle ourselves, I think, with the baggage of we've tried it before, or this has been done before and it failed, or we can't do this, you will go down a death path. You really have to be able to have the mindset. And I think that's ultimately, you know, what we're all talking about is the mindset of a leader. That is, what does the future hold that I know? What don't I know? And how do I get information about it? And then what change am I going to lead? What's the vision that I have? Or that we have, actually, I should say that we have collectively to be in the best position that we can be. And that might mean, how do we evolve? How do we change to be, because if our background legislation was created in the world of 1930, that's very different than where we're going. And it might be time to update.
Thank you. And Sasha.
Thank you. Just to build on the theme, I guess, sort of starting with Bethany talking about sort of building on success, right? And the capability that we've seen, and again, in the national security space, in the public health space, and then holding on to this idea, though, of really this imperative for change. The one thing I would add, I couldn't agree more, this sort of blue sky thinking about what government is has got to be on the table and evolve. But I would add the other side of that coin is holding on to what is dear and different about government needs to be explicit as well, right? In government, efficiency is not the only value, right? Like, yes, people can do it faster, right? We know that. But in government, we are balancing, right, a lot of things in a way that the private sector isn't. So to me, the skill is really condensing or isolating what are those things that are worth being slower for, that are worth dealing with all the stakeholders for, right? That are worth the bureaucracy and all those pieces we're familiar for. Holding on to that, isolating that, holding on to that as we evolve to the extent possible to meet the world of tomorrow, right? And that to me is the skill, because it's not as simple as saying, someone brought this up, like, do it the way the private sector does it. I'm like, okay. But I don't think that's what you want in, say, crime enforcement, right? Like, we could just round everyone up or have people pay, right? Like, that's not what we do. So how do you balance, right, that very core of what government is and how it's different with the imperative to change and grow and respond to the environment, and keeping that in balance and keeping that as an explicit conversation, I think is the real kind of trick going forward.
Awesome. Thank you. And Reggie, I have loved moderating with you over this series. Thank you and everyone at Key so much. Thank you to our great panelists. Thanks everyone for joining us today and throughout this series. And Reggie, final thoughts?
It was a great series. I loved moderating with you too. We've had outstanding panels, and I love Bethany's cat.
I know.
She's a favorite.
See, we didn't have to worry about our new coworkers being bots. They're Bethany's cats, my dog, you know. So thank you, everyone.
And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge Bree and Lamon's technical support. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much for letting me pair up with Michelle.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the great comments.
Great job. Thank you so much.